On the outer shoulder of a forgotten hill in North Carolina, wrapped in mist and riddled with roots older than the war, a rooster began to crow. Not to the sun, as you'd expect, but to music. Not just any music. Guitar. Rust-bitten, soul-drenched, neck-prickling guitar. The kind that makes your ribs hum, even when it's leaking from a warped speaker older than memory itself. His timing was strange, uncanny. Clean, precise. A single crow in sync with an ending riff. Then quiet. Then another, right on the downbeat. Someone might have said it was luck the first day. Just a coincidence by the second. But by the end of the week, even the wind seemed to listen when he sang. Down the hill stood a weather-worn white farmhouse with green shutters that never closed right and tomatoes rotting on the windowsill. That was Helen Mayweather's place. And she knew better than to believe in coincidence. Especially when the songs the rooster crowed to were the same ones her husband used to play before he died. Arthur had always turned the volume too loud. He used to fill the barn with Springsteen while he tinkered with engines, blew dust off vinyls like they were sacred scripture, and once told Helen that guitar solos were the only language God truly understood. He died 9 springs ago with a Les Paul still hanging on the wall by the back door and the radio off. Dead silent. Until Tuesday. That particular morning, the fog was thick enough to chew. Helen rose before the kettle even considered boiling, out of habit more than need. The house felt heavy in her lungs. She tugged on her cardigan, the elbows worn thin with years, and stepped out onto the porch, mug in hand, just as she had every morning since the air stopped holding his breath. And then she heard it. Low, crackling, a guitar, slow, smooth, and resolute, crawling up out of the barn like dust rising on a sunbeam. At first, she thought it had to be a neighbor. Maybe someone's kid playing too loud in a pickup. But no, it was closer. Coming from the old radio. Arthur's radio. The one they'd left sitting on the shelf above the workbench, broken and silent since the day they buried him. Helen's knees didn't tremble so much as freeze. The mug didn't drop, it just missed her lips as she forgot what she was doing. Then came that sound, the rooster. Not squawking wildly, but one single, precise crow. Loud, sure, then silence. Then, as if on cue, the guitar rumbled into a chorus. And the rooster, he crowed again, softer, drawn out, straddling the melody like he understood where it was going. Helen stepped off the porch. The walk to the barn felt longer than usual, like her legs belonged to a memory that hadn't caught up yet. The sound led her, note after note, unfolding like a slow waltz down a hallway she thought she'd locked shut. She reached the barn door, hand on the latch, pulse in her throat. She expected static, maybe wind. Instead, Lynyrd Skynyrd, and a mottled old rooster, beating his wings once, lifting his beak, and letting out a cry right as the chorus swelled. Helen didn't move, couldn't. Her breath hung like threads in the cold. It wasn't possible. And yet, that was Arthur's song, his favorite, the one he played when they danced in the kitchen floor, barefoot on linoleum worn slick before they ever bothered to remodel. The same song he played when the power went out once, years ago, and they sang it by candlelight, a bottle of wine between them and nothing else in the world. Now it was playing in her barn. And the rooster? Impossible, she whispered, but the radio didn't glitch. The sound was too warm. Too real. The rooster crowed one more time, softer this time, then turned his head and looked at her. Just looked. Quiet settled again, except for the final guitar fade. Still streaming, still alive, from a radio that hadn't turned on for the better part of a decade. Helen stood there, not sure if she was hearing music or memory or both woven together into something new. She stepped inside. The radio was unplugged. The rooster sat down. Helen turned, looked back up the hill at her house. The hollow windows, the porch swing, the place where mornings had gone unnoticed for years now. And for a flicker of a second, she felt something stir in her gut. Not fear, not grief, just curiosity, the kind she hadn't felt since before Arthur died. She glanced at the rooster. He blinked, slow and deliberate. Behind him, the barn light buzzed once and then dimmed. She said nothing, but later that evening, she opened an old drawer, pulled out a notebook, and wrote. November 3 to 7:48 a.m. Rooster crowed to, simple man. Synced with chorus. Watched me the whole time. Radios unplugged. Still played. Not sure what this means yet. But I'm listening. Mornings used to come slow and thick with silence for Helen Mayweather. The kind of silence that seeps into wallpaper, into the folds of old letters, into the way spoons clink too loudly against porcelain. That Tuesday morning broke it. Shattered it like brittle glass. But the silence returned the next day, only different. It had been reshaped, touched by something, like someone had opened the door to a sealed-off memory, and now it drifted in through the windows again. Helen sat at her kitchen table, long before the rooster's cry came again, staring at the radio logged in her notebook. She traced the last line she'd written with her finger. Her handwriting wobbled, not because of her age, but something else. A tremble in the knowing. Unknowing. She folded the notebook shut. Then, at exactly 7:48, the sound came again. Music. Skinnered again, but a different track. Tuesday's gone. Haunting. Wide like a canyon. The rooster's call came soft this time, layered like harmony. It settled into the guitar, not over it, not under, inside it. She stepped out into the cold air. The sky had bruised shades of lilac and frost, and the earth was still waking up. The rooster stood by the barn door now, not in the co-op. Waiting, facing her. Something pulled her forward. Helen crossed the gravel path, flat shoes brushing against frostbitten leaves, her breath catching in clouds before her. In her peripheral, the barn windows flickered. The radio hummed from within, rich and warm and absolutely, undeniably alive. She opened the door before thinking if she should. Inside, the barn smelled like cedar and thyme. And something sweeter, like old cigars and grease, the blend of Arthur's life etched into the wood. The workbench stood untouched, tools arranged just the way he left them. And on the shelf, the radio, still humming. She walked over slowly, placed her hand against its rusted top. Still unplugged, still warm. She pulled the stool over and sat. For the first time in 9 years, Helen just listened. When the song ended, the rooster let out one final note. Soft, letting it trail into the silence again like an exhale. Was that for him? She whispered. The rooster tilted his head. She didn't expect an answer. But later, when she returned to the house, she found something strange. One of Arthur's old shirts was laid out on the porch swing. Folded. It hadn't been there before. She hadn't unfolded that trunk in years. She picked it up. Threadbare. Smelled like dust and faint cedar. She clutched it close, then called out, half to a memory, half to the wide air. You still here, you old fool? No one answered, but from the barn, the radio sputtered. And then silence. The rain came just after midnight, sheets of it brushing the tin roof like fingers on a steel drum. Helen lay awake, one arm draped over the empty side of the bed. The dreams had been heavier lately, flavored with guitar chords and warm barn air. The kind of memories that weren't quite memories. Echoes, maybe. She heard the thunder rumble long and low, like something rolling over in its sleep. Then, between the strikes, something different. Music. Faint. As though the night itself had a soundtrack. She pulled on her boots. No coat. Just muscle memory and curiosity wrapped beneath a cotton cardigan. The rain hit her shoulders in cold slants as she stepped outside. Her breath mixed with the fog. And there it was again, note by note. Coming from the barn, she moved across the gravel, wet and unsteady beneath her soles. The wind tore through the trees and carried with it the unmistakable sound. The guitar, brighter now, layered with reverb, tremolo, and something like longing. She reached the barn doors and pushed them open. The radio glowed even brighter than before. Something in its core pulsed orange, like the inside of a candle. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. And then, right on cue, the rooster crowed. Not loud, soft. Like a whisper. Like the final note of a lullaby. It layered beneath the guitar line perfectly. A harmony, delicate and raw. Helen stepped closer, the water from her cardigan dripping onto the dusty floor. She could see her breath in the barn now. It hung between her and the glowing radio like a veil. The rooster turned its head, slow, calm, and looked at her again. This time, something flickered in his eyes. Something knowing. The song playing wasn't from the station. She knew that immediately. It was All Along the Watchtower. And she knew it because Arthur had only played it once. The night before he died. They'd been slow dancing, the power out again from a windstorm. He'd lit a single oil lamp. Put the record on. Told her, this one's for when the world turns to ghosts. He never said what he meant. Now, nearly a decade later, the song lived again. The guitar heels locked step with rain on the roof. The rooster didn't crow again, just stood there at the center of it, like a metronome keeping time for the dead. Helen moved her hand toward the radio. Hovered there. It was warm, impossibly so. The knobs didn't move, the display was clouded with dust. But the song played clean, unbroken. She closed her eyes, just for a second, and thought she heard footsteps. Not behind her, not beside her, inside her, echoes of bare feet on linoleum. Of Arthur's laugh. Of calloused fingers sliding along frets in rhythm with her heartbeat. She opened her eyes again. The radio was dimming, slowly, not shutting off, settling. And the rooster had taken a seat beneath the workbench, his head tucked beneath one wing, like someone exhausted after telling the truth for the first time in years. Helen stepped back and let the barn door close behind her. The rain had softened, the moon peeked through a ragged corner of cloud. And in her chest, something ached that hadn't ached in years, not pain exactly, but tenderness. Like something fragile waking up. When she returned to the porch, her hand brushed against the old wicker chair, and there, set neatly beside it, was a guitar pick. Black. Worn. The kind Arthur used. She hadn't seen one since the day they boxed his things. She lifted it slowly, turned it over, felt the shallow indent of initials carved long ago. AAM, Arthur Mayweather, and on the pick, just beneath the initials, a song title scratched faintly. Watchtower. The wind stirred her cardigan. The rain had stopped. She lowered herself onto the porch swing and didn't cry. But she didn't smile, either. She just listened, and for a breath of a moment, between the gusts, she thought she heard a guitar being tuned. Somewhere beyond the trees. Somewhere beyond the now. The next morning came with a lightness that confused Helen. The air outside shimmered, new and clean after the storm, and for the first time in a long while, the sun cast soft shadows instead of harsh truths. She sat on the porch with her tea, steam rising from the chipped mug, fingers resting on the guitar pick now tucked deep in her sweater pocket. At first, there was nothing. No music, no crowing, only the hush of a new day, the kind that waits, unsure of its next breath. She waited too, a long while. The tea cooled, her hope didn't. Then, faint, just enough to raise the hairs on her arms, music drifted from the barn again. This time it was Simple Man, again, but slower, drawn out like the song itself remembered how it had sounded yesterday. Each note felt larger than it needed to be. Echoed more. Helen stood slowly, crossed the porch. Each step toward the barn felt wrapped in velvet. The gravel didn't crunch beneath her feet, it cushioned them. The rooster was standing at the open barn door this time, as though waiting not to sing, but to see if she was coming. His feathers were damp from the storm. His head was tilted, not in confusion, but deliberate curiosity, like he knew something she didn't yet. She reached the edge of the doorway and stopped. Inside, the radio was glowing again. Fainter now, dim like a candle hours deep into its wick, but still there, steady. The song filled the space between them, knee-deep in memory. The rooster let out a single cry, sharp, then softened, landing perfectly between verse and chorus. Helen blinked, but didn't look away. Her hand gripped the edge of the doorframe. The air inside smelled sweeter than the day before. Not like cedar, not like dust, like sweat on Arthur's shoulder after they danced. Like old vinyl spinning in the middle of a blackout. She crossed into the barn. For the first time, she spoke to the rooster. "You know more than you're letting on." He blinked. The radio slid into another song. This one not rock. Not quite. Folk. Flamenco tinged. Spanish guitar. Something Arthur wouldn't have usually picked. But Helen remembered it. He'd learned this riff to surprise her one Valentine's Day. She remembered laughing when he got the rhythm wrong and spilled juice all over the rug. She hadn't remembered that in years. Until now. She lowered herself onto Arthur's old stool. It creaked under her. The barn light flickered, dim but warm. She didn't look at the radio this time. She watched the rooster. He didn't crow, just looked at her. Two old things sitting in quiet understanding. She reached for the rusted knob on the radio, just to test. It wouldn't turn. She didn't push it. The music kept playing, clean, alive, utterly impossible. But not unwelcome. She whispered, "You don't need me to fix you." The rooster took a step closer. The barn creaked with the movement, like a hush deepened by attention. Outside, the wind stirred the frost-bitten leaves across the fields. A soft rustle, enough to pull Helen's attention sideways. When she looked back, the radio had faded mid-song. Stopped without static, without fanfare, like a curtain lowering after a final bow. She stayed on the stool a long time after that. Hours maybe, not waiting for a song. Just thinking, if you could call it that. Remembering slowly, deliberately. By the time she stepped outside again, the rooster was at her heel. She walked him back like he was a dear friend seeing her home after a long evening. As they reached the porch, she noticed something folded on the bench beside her door. Another shirt. A second one from the trunk. But not folded like before. No, this one was warm. Slightly damp from the barn's air, but fresh. As if someone had just taken it from the line. She pressed it to her face. It smelled exactly like him. Inside the shirt's chest pocket, something small and square. She pulled it free. A restaurant napkin. Faded ink. Red ballpoint. Just 3 words. "Still with you." Her knees wobbled. Not from fear. Not from shock. But grace. She sat, the rooster settling near her feet. And for the first time in a decade, Helen Mayweather sang. Not well. Not to be heard. But to remember. Helen didn't sleep that night. She sat with the rooster at her feet, the napkin folded twice in her hand, its creases soft with age and ghostwriting. The fire in her hearth had dimmed to coals, the kind that pulse red and quiet, like an engine cooling down after remembering how to run. She left the napkin on the windowsill and went to bed just before dawn. When the rooster crowed the next morning, it was early, before sunrise. A broken rhythm, raw and offbeat. Helen sat up in bed, unsure if it was real or something from her dreams. But the radio was playing again. She could hear it faintly across the field. No lyrics, just a riff, low and mournful, slower than usual, like breathing through heavy cotton, like bones remembering how to move. She didn't rush. She brewed her tea, wrapped herself in the same cardigan, picked up a shawl Arthur's mother had knitted 40 years ago, long before her hands forgot what kindness looked like. Then she went toward the barn. The morning was wrapped in fog, but not the cold kind. It wasn't heavy this time. It felt like the kind of fog that knew when to keep quiet. The rooster stood alone just outside the barn door, his head down. He didn't greet her. He didn't need to. Inside, the radio glowed, not as strong as before. The sound coming out of it had a warble now, like it was playing through water. Helen froze when she recognized the song. All along the watchtower. Again. But this time, slower. Disintegrating. The exact moment the chorus hit, the rooster gave the faintest sound she had ever heard from him. Barely a thread of a crow. A breath lost in someone else's memory. She knelt beside him. His feathers had dulled, slightly matted at the tips. And he looked so small in the morning light. He didn't lift his head. Just leaned it gently against her knee like it was the only anchor left. Helen didn't speak. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't blow away in that moment. The song ended halfway through, the radio skipping like a broken record. No static, no fade out. The glow dimmed until it vanished completely. When she reached for it, it was cold. Not just not glowing, cold like something had left. She stayed there, hand over the radio, until her knees ached and the rooster shivered once beneath her palm. She stood finally, slow and deliberate, and looked out into the field. The barn door had swung open wider behind her. A breeze passed through, and for just a second, she swore she saw movement out in the morning fog. A figure, backlit, tall. Shoulders hunched. Guitar slung over one arm. But it was gone when she blinked. The rooster stirred. He gave a strangled little cry, hardly a noise. Then went quiet again. Helen bent low and lifted him. He didn't resist. And she carried him back to the porch, wrapped in the shawl, the way she'd carried Arthur's leather jacket from the hospital that terrible day with the rain so sudden and meaningless. The chair creaked softly as she sat. She rocked. He didn't move, just rested. And from the barn, for one last time, came a single, haunting sound. A guitar string, plucked once. Nothing more. Helen didn't open the notebook that morning. It still sat on the kitchen table where she left it, pages fluttering ever so slightly when the breeze slipped past the window panes. She just looked at it, like one might look at a picture they weren't ready to remember. Instead, she poured her tea, sat in the rocker, waited. The shawl was still wrapped around the rooster. He lay beside her on a folded towel, eyes closed but not asleep. Breathing so softly you'd miss it if you didn't know he was there. No music came, no crowing, just the sounds of a farmhouse too quiet to be empty. Something within Helen had begun to understand a rhythm beyond sound. A tempo that pulsed just under the surface, like the heartbeat of the land itself had slowed to listen. She reached for the shawl's edge, tucked it closer around him. He didn't stir. By mid-morning, she walked to the barn, not out of hope, but habit. The door hung open like it had been waiting. Inside, the radio sat dark. She touched it anyway. It was colder than metal should be in spring. She didn't stay long. The air inside wasn't thick, but it felt like walking through a memory too worn to touch. She turned off the light, not that it mattered, and stepped back outside. The breeze that met her cheeks was warm and fragrant, laced with wild onion and early blossoms. Back on the porch, the rooster stirred when she returned. She sat again, cradled his form lightly into her lap. And that's when it happened. A sound, soft, uncertain. Not full music, no melody. Just the faintest hum. A vibration, almost too low to hear, drifting up from the space around them. Then, notes. Sparse. A familiar phrase. Piano this time, delicate, almost tender. Helen looked toward the barn, but saw no light, no movement. Then the music grew, only a little, and unmistakably clear. Imagine, by John Lennon. The rooster opened his eyes once, lifted his head, barely, and let out the softest crow she had ever heard. Not sharp, not loud. Just sound woven into sadness. A farewell in harmony. His head dropped gently back to her chest. And didn't rise again. Helen sat still. She didn't weep. Not right away. There was only the music. And the weight of something holy in her arms. The song continued, and then, as quietly as it had come, faded out. When it ended, so did the wind. And Helen, for the first time in her long, silent mornings, whispered something to no one. Thank you. The next day stretched out longer than it should have. Helen didn't speak, barely moved. The rooster, wrapped now in cloth and quiet, rested beneath a ginkgo tree behind the barn. No hymn, no words, just dirt and sky, and Helen's two hands pressing gently against the earth. By evening, a distant knock echoed across the porch. She thought it might have been wind at first. Or a branch. The house had a habit of pretending to be alive. But then it came again. Not loud, just steady. She opened the door. There stood a stranger. Younger than her by some decades, wiry in frame but careful in posture, like someone who asked permission before breathing too loudly. He held a soft brown guitar case in one hand and wore a wool jacket far too warm for the season. "Ma'am," he said, removing his cap. "Sorry to bother. You don't know me, but I'm Thomas. Arthur Mayweather was my uncle." Helen didn't answer immediately. She looked at him the way you'd look at a name heard once long ago, tucked somewhere between junk drawers and family recipes. "He used to visit us when I was a kid," Thomas added. "Played guitar. Taught me some, too." Her throat tightened. He never mentioned a nephew. "We weren't close," he said, voice thinner now. "But we wrote a few times when I got older. He sent me records. Always marked his favorites. Said if I never learned to play Hendrix, I didn't deserve to hold a pick." Helen's mouth almost curved. Almost. Thomas looked past her, toward the yard. "I heard a story," he said. "Kind of a ghost tale. Old rooster out here singing to music. Thought it was just some local tall talker, but..." Helen opened the screen door wider. He took the invitation with quiet gratitude and stepped inside. They didn't sit. Not yet. She led him through the hallway, past pictures whose frames hadn't been dusted, past worn rugs and a coat still hanging by the door, Arthur's. She glanced at Thomas once. "It's gone quiet now." "Still?" he said gently. "Could I see the place?" She nodded. Outside, the light had dipped into amber. The barn looked painted in shadow and memory. Inside, nothing played. The radio sat where it always had. Dark. Silent. Thomas moved slowly, Kneeling down, he opened the guitar case and lifted it from its cradle. Mahogany with faded frets, worn along the fifth string like someone had practiced the same song too many times. "Uncle taught me on this," he murmured. He ran his fingers along the strings. And then, without asking, he played it. Just a few chords. Little Wing, by Hendrix. No vocals, just notes dry as dust and beautiful all the same. And then, the radio crackled. Helen gasped. The hum rose, barely there, like a breath come back. And the rooster's perch, still cold and empty now, seemed to grow lighter in presence. Thomas didn't stop playing. He closed his eyes. "You hear that?" he whispered. Helen nodded once. When the final chord ended, the silence returned, but not heavy. Not quiet, either. Just full. Like something had been heard. He looked at her, eyes laced with disbelief and tenderness. "That's the exact track he taught me on," he said. "Every lick, every slide." Helen crossed to the notebook on the shelf and flipped through its pages. Her finger stopped, tapped one line. February 12 to 7:59 a.m. Little Wing, radio incorrect station. Rooster crowed mid-solo. 3 times. Thomas sat back on his heels. "I don't know what this is," he said softly. "But I think Uncle Arthur's got unfinished songs." Helen nodded. "Seems he found someone to finish them." The sky turned a hard gray by late afternoon, the kind that crawled over the mountains like an old blanket, damp and quiet. The storm was coming. Helen could feel it in her ankles before the clouds even opened their mouths. She stood at the sink, rinsing out a teacup, staring through the window at the empty barn. The rooster had been gone a week now. The mornings still felt like they were missing their wings. Thunder rumbled in the distance, deep, unsettled. The wind tugged at the shutters hard enough to make her flinch. Her hands lingered in the dishwater longer than they needed to. She turned off the faucet, dried her hands, looked at the sky, then to the barn. The storm rolled in like something it had been waiting to finish. She was lighting the oil lamp when the first crack of lightning hit. Then darkness. Total. Her breath caught. Not from fear. Something else. Silence had weight again. And just like that, music. No intro. No static. Just the first clean strum of a guitar like someone flicked open a memory. It came from the barn. Back alive. She grabbed her shawl, heart pressing against the bones of her chest like it wanted out, and opened the door. Rain slammed into her so fast she didn't brace. Just walked into it, barefoot, the way one steps into certain griefs after time. Her feet hit the gravel like rhythm, like pulse. She reached the barn, pulled open the door against the force of the wind. The inside glowed. The radio wasn't just on, it blazed emerald and gold, brighter than ever before. The kind of light that shouldn't come from something that old. And standing directly across from her, soaked but calm, was the rooster. Not a sound from him yet. Just a look. The same tired, knowing glance he had given her all those months ago. And then, as the music climbed into its chorus, he crowed. Once. Loud. But not desperate. Like punctuation. "He's back," she whispered. The rooster hopped once in place, wings fluttering just wide enough to brush the rain from his sides. She stepped forward into the barn. Before she could reach for the radio, it changed songs. No pause, no fade in. Just a hard cut. "Dream On," Aerosmith. The notes hit like rain on metal, sharp, full of ache. But the rooster lifted his head, then turned slightly. To the corner. And there, impossibly, was Arthur's guitar. Hanging exactly where it had always been. She hadn't seen it in months. Hadn't touched it in years. Her knees swayed for a moment as the barn swam gently before her eyes. She reached for the guitar. It came off the hook like it had been waiting. The neck felt warm. She strummed once, no chord, unsure. The barn seemed to hold its breath. The rooster looked up at her. Then crowed again, brief, like approval. Then silence. The song dipped into the quiet bridge, guitar lines wavering, fading into softness. Helen stood with the guitar in her hands and realized, for the first time since he died, her fingers didn't tremble when she held it. The rain slowed, thunder rolled farther away, and just as the final line of the song came through, half-cut, full of echo. "Sing with me, if it's just for today." The radio dimmed, and the rooster crowed once more, then dropped his head and settled into the straw. Helen sat down beside him, the guitar across her legs. Neither of them moved, but for a moment, she swore she felt Arthur's hand on her shoulder. Warm, still calloused, still here. Helen didn't leave the porch for 3 days. She brought meals out with her, small things she barely touched. Most of her time was spent in that chair, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the barn like it still held breath. The rooster stopped crowing. He followed her once, the morning after the storm, trailing behind like a shadow stitched to her heels. But by afternoon, he moved slower, rested more. His steps became cautious, hesitant. She laid towels over a crate near her rocker, and he took it without protest. Curled up like something already halfway gone. He didn't cry, didn't call, just waited. The radio hadn't made a sound since that night. Not a hum, not a whisper. Dead silent, though Helen still swore it blinked once, just as the sun crested. By the 4th morning, the rooster didn't stir at all. Helen touched his feathers. They were warm, but without edge. Like paper left in the sun too long, softened to near weightlessness. She placed her hand over his back, feeling breath still come and go, but slow. Slower than a song's last measure. She murmured to him, nonsense things. Things Arthur used to murmur when he thought she was asleep. Bits of old tunes. A line or two of poetry. That evening, a breeze brushed the porch, not hard, but certain. It carried the scent of tobacco leaves and cinnamon. Her eyes stung. Then, a strum. Just one. Too clear to be imagined. Too brief to chase. It came from the direction of the barn. Helen looked toward the horizon where the sky curled into lavender. There, the ginkgo tree caught the dying light and shimmered gold. She turned back to the rooster. He stirred. One wing flicked slightly. His beak opened, then paused, like he'd thought of crowing, but hadn't the strength or reason anymore. Then his eyes found hers. Long, still, and just like that, he let go. No sound, no convulsion, just stillness. Helen didn't move, didn't weep. She lowered her palm until it rested flat against his side. A beat passed, then a second, and then, music. From the barn, faint, but unmistakably alive. It was, "Let It Be." Paul's voice, low and reverent. The harmonies wrapped the porch like wind. Helen closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, mouthed the words. There was a moment, somewhere between verse and bridge, where the wind shifted. Not louder, brighter, and for a flicker of time, she felt warmth settle beside her on the rocker. As if someone had come home after a long drive with nothing to unpack but silence. Her fingers brushed against the guitar still beside her chair. And for a long while, she just listened. It had been 3 days since the rooster passed beneath the ginkgo tree. Helen had taken to speaking aloud again, not like conversation, exactly, but stitching her thoughts into the quiet air as she moved through the house. Baking without kneading the bread. Sweeping floors just for the rhythm. There was something comforting in motion, in old habits re-inhabited. She hadn't dared play music herself. The record player remained untouched, a dusted shadow in the living room corner. That morning, the sky wore a veil of pearl gray. She rose early, not by alarm, but by some quiet instinct. She dressed in a cardigan Arthur used to tease her for, tattered sleeves tucked into themselves, and padded into the kitchen. The bookmark in her notebook hadn't moved. A blank page waited. No crows, no music. Helen stepped to the porch and looked out over the field. Pale fog clung low to the earth. The ginkgo tree stood gold-tinged and watching. The silence wasn't cruel today. Just full. Then a sound, barely audible. A crackle from inside. Her eyes went to the house. Not the barn. The living room. She stepped inside. Stopped. The record player's dust cover was lifted. And its red light blinked. Still plugged in, still inert for years. Still, now on, as if nothing had ever stopped. Though her knees tensed, Helen didn't hesitate. Her fingers moved as if someone else guided them. She reached for a record from the shelf. Imagine, the same LP Arthur had kept closest. She placed it gently, lowered the needle. The crackle surfaced like a ghost clearing its throat. Then, piano. Simple, spare. Helen exhaled. She stepped to the window and opened it. Cool air caressed her face. In the tree beyond the barn, two birds stirred. Quiet shapes glimpsed through dawn. She turned back to the chair where the rooster used to sit. On the cushion, a feather. Soft gray shot through with gold. She smiled. Not big, not wide, but real. Then something tugged at her chest like a memory unfolding inward. The song reached its refrain. And just as Lennon's voice whispered hope, another sound joined. Not crow, not voice, just vibration, like the low hum of an amp catching breath. She looked toward the hallway. Nothing, but she swore, she heard a guitar string flick, deep and soft. Helen closed her eyes, held her tea with both hands, and let herself sway in time. To piano, to memory, to the last morning where the world still sang in rhythm. Helen waited until the sun was warm enough to soften the frost on the grass before stepping outside. She bundled the rooster's cloth one last time, folded with more care than ceremony, and tucked beneath her arm a small trowel, a tin pail of marigolds, and Arthur's old garden gloves. The spot beneath the ginkgo tree was already dappled in light. She had chosen it quietly the night before, in her sleep, or perhaps in that slow half-thinking that lives closer to prayer than planning. When she knelt, the earth gave easily. The soil was soft but rooted through with threads of memory, stones, leaves, and small tangled shoots. She dug slowly, each movement deliberate. The gloves, large on her hands, slipped a little with each turn. She paused sometimes, breathing into her sleeve, the cloth catching the sound before it could rise. He weighed nothing now, feather light, still. She placed him gently into the ground, folded the cloth tighter as though wrapping up a secret, and pressed the dirt back with the flat of her hands. When the pail tipped, the marigolds spilled, bright gold and stubborn. Like him, she planted 3, in a row, the way Arthur used to say was best for keeping things honest. Then she sat back, not on a chair, not on a bench, just on the ground. The tree leaned slightly overhead, leaves rustling like pages too old to read but too precious to throw away. She didn't speak, not at first, but the quiet wasn't empty. It held her carefully. She stayed there until the shadows moved. And then something strange happened. The wind shifted gently through the tree, and small things began appearing. First, a polished stone, set carefully near the base of the tree. Then a feather, placed with what had to be intention. A dusty guitar pick. A paper flower. By afternoon, more had come. A boy from the edge of town stopped by. He'd never met Helen before. Just a small voice and 2 braids wrapped in ribbon. He stood a moment at the tree, then placed a drawing by the marigolds, a crooked bird with headphones and Mr. Rhythm scrawled across the top. Helen watched from the porch. She didn't wave, didn't rise, but her heart did something it hadn't done in years. It hummed. By evening, a teenager left a vinyl, Fleetwood Mac. A couple visiting from Asheville drove in slow, said nothing, and left a folded note that read, "Thank you for the mornings." Helen read every word. She laid each offering gently in a shoebox she kept near the front door. Arthur's old cigar box became the Rooster's archive. The town didn't speak about it loudly, but it knew, somehow, knew there had been something sacred in the music and the mornings. And it honored it the only way it could. By remembering, quietly, together. Helen began locking her doors less often. She left the porch light on every night that spring. People came and went, left scraps of what they couldn't say. She received a hand-sewn stuffed rooster in a brown paper bag. Guitar strings coiled like bracelets. A napkin with only the words, "He sang to my song too." She wrote them all down in her notebook. Dated, numbered. On the last page, under a line drawn faintly in pencil, she wrote, "All songs end, only rhythm remains." The sewing machine hadn't been used in years. Its hum was foreign at first, jagged and irregular like an old memory trying to find its pulse. Helen leaned forward at her kitchen table, glasses slipping down the ridge of her nose. Hands working slowly through the pile of old shirts stacked beside her. Arthur's shirts. Band logos faded with wash and time. Zeppelin, the Beatles, Pink Floyd. Each one folded with care, creases falling into familiar lines. She hadn't washed some of them at all. Just aired them lightly and pressed them with warm hands. They carried a scent not quite definable. Dust, cotton, old wood smoke. Him. The first cut had been the hardest. She sat in silence for 10 minutes before using the scissors. But once the fabric parted, gently, clean, it stopped feeling like destruction. It felt like translation. Each square she cut held a story. A night at the county fair. A dance in the living room. A missed anniversary they made up for with midnight pancakes. She laid each square on the table like pieces of sheet music, arranging them by feel instead of color. In the evenings, she stitched. The light from the porch scooped into the room in soft ribbons. Sometimes, the radio flickered, but without sound. Sometimes, the record player blinked. Silent. Watching. But she didn't need its songs anymore. She remembered them. Each stitch was a chorus. Free Fallin', in the red flannel with cigarette burn on the hem. Sweet Caroline, in the denim shirt she once wore herself, tied at the waist during a July they never quite stopped laughing. Imagine, embroidered next to a faded tee he bought too big on purpose. It took her 3 weeks. By the end, her fingers were raw, but a good raw, like after picking blackberries or building something with your own weight behind it. The quilt was heavy, not with thread, not with fabric. With time. One square, the center, was made from the rooster's blanket. That same soft cloth she'd wrapped him in on the porch swing. She'd embroidered a single note into it. Just one. She laid the quilt over her lap that night as she sat by the fire. No music played, no crow split the air, but she felt warmth press around her, gentle and slow. A weight. She began to hum. It wasn't a song she recognized, not exactly. Bits of others stitched together. A half-remembered bridge, a chorus from someone else's kitchen, the rhythm of feathers brushing straw at dawn. When a breeze slid through the open window and rustled the quilt's edge, she looked toward the barn, though there was no need. Then she spoke aloud, to no one, and maybe to someone. I kept the beat, and for a heartbeat after. Everything answered in stillness, the kind that holds applause without needing to give it. Summer came slowly, like someone opening a curtain one finger at a time. The hills greened deeper. The marigolds beneath the ginkgo bloomed too early, bright and gold like they couldn't be held back. Helen sat often on the porch now with the quilt wrapped loosely around her waist, watching the wind press gentle rhythms into the grass. She had stopped checking the radio. Stopped listening for things that once whispered across her floorboards. Now, she just watched. And waited, without knowing what for. Then one morning, around the end of June, she stepped into the co-op to scatter feed and found her hens restless, crowding one corner like feathered gossip. Beneath them, warm and tucked in straw, were 3 small eggs. 3. She blinked. It had been years since one so much as tried. Helen crouched slowly, careful not to disturb them. She touched the edges of one shell, paper smooth and already humming with something old. Maybe remembered. She said nothing, didn't even smile, just nodded, and began adding extra feed each morning. Weeks passed. And then, cracks. Tiny fractures like spider webs appeared in the eggshells, tracing centuries into something brand new. One hatched at dawn in a hush. Another at dusk when the cicadas thrummed. And the third, days later, stubborn, late, on a humid morning that hung too full of silence. The newest chick was odd. Its feathers came in patchy, gray with bursts of gold at the edges. A thin black stripe curved along its back, almost like a note on parchment. It didn't peep loud like the others. But it watched more. The other hens gave it space. Helen named her Larkspur, mostly because it sounded right when whispered. She began to keep Larkspur near. The chick nestled often in the crook of her cardigan, asleep against memory and wool. Then, one morning far too early, the house woke her. Not with music, but something close. A humming. Helen blinked into the dark, rose with a heartbeat that suddenly didn't feel hers. She stepped softly into the living room. And her record player glowed. Faint green. A single dot. Waiting. She crossed to it, breath shallow. It clicked once, mechanically. And the needle dropped. Warm vinyl scratch surfaced. Then, Here Comes the Sun. Guitar first. Then strings. Helen turned, startled by soft movement. Larkspur, now barely more than a palmful of plumes, stood perched at the hearth. Head tilted, feathers puffed ever so slightly. Then, she sang. Not a crow, not squawk, but a sound, round and rhythmic, something between a trill and a whisper, perfectly laced between George's opening lines. Helen sunk to the floor, hands covering her mouth. The chick stopped singing as the first verse faded. Watched her, then blinked. Once. Slow. Helen laughed softly, a sound cracked from lack of use. She scooped Larkspur up, held her close. The chick's warmth stitched neatly between the chords on the record. You clever thing, she whispered. Outside, the light began to shift. Summer peeled open the sky. And far beyond sunrise, Helen swore she could hear feathers against frets. Again. Helen rocked slowly in the porch chair, the rhythm deep and faintly musical, the kind of motion a body remembers even after the reasons fade. The quilt, gently frayed now, lay folded across her lap, corners faded where her hands had lingered most. Beneath it, the record spun again. Not because she needed to hear the music, but because the house had asked for it. A breeze lifted the edge of the hem. She pressed it down absently, sipping tea that had already gone lukewarm. Let it be, floated soft and low from behind the screen door. She didn't sing along, not aloud. Her humming was quieter, more instinct than practice. Off in the tall grass, birds danced near the edge of the wheat. Finches, maybe, small, unsure things, trading place and voice. One called, another answered, and then they fell into silence again, the kind children give to old stories right before the ending. She adjusted the pillow behind her back. Her knees ached more than they used to, but not enough to keep her still. Beneath the ginkgo tree, marigolds bloomed in full defiance against the coming autumn. Someone had left a harmonica at the base a day or two ago. She hadn't touched it, just let it be. A gust picked up, not sharp, just wide. And with it, across the top of the rise, a sound. Not a crow, not quite birdsong, but something that echoed them both. Helen smiled gently, without teeth. She didn't rise. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the horizon where the hills curled soft as bread dough, and shadows stitched themselves like thread through the golden grass. Wind brushed her cheek, and there, for a single breath, she thought she heard something familiar in it. A crow laced with strings. A guitar tuned low. A laugh. Maybe. She rocked once more. Deep inhale through her nose, slow exhale that caught at the tail of the song. Then a voice, her own, rose in her mind from somewhere older than memory. "I'll meet you right here," she murmured. Same song, just later, and the porch, old and weathered, held her gently in its arms. The house had learned to breathe again. Not loudly. Nothing about Helen's world ever shouted. But the windows no longer rattled with the silence of grief. The tick of the kitchen clock no longer sounded like a drumbeat in a cave. It all moved softer now, like someone whispering a story they already know the end to. She had begun speaking to herself, not out of loneliness, not anymore. Just to keep rhythm, just to mark the days like songs, small and deliberate. In the mornings, she'd hum while grinding coffee. In the afternoons, she'd let her fingers rest on the quilt, picking notes that didn't need sound. People still visited. Some brought music, cassettes or thumb drives filled with songs they thought the Rooster might have liked. Kids dropped drawings into the mailbox. One had mailed a paper crane folded from sheet music. Helen kept them all in a drawer by the stove. She opened it sometimes just to feel the weight of melody pressing against her fingers. She never told them everything. Only what needed saying. She called the Rooster rhythm now. Not to anyone else. Just in her head. Not as a name, but a truth. Because that's what he'd been, wasn't he? The space between crows. The beat under sorrow. The measure keeping time when time wandered. That fall, there came a night where the sky was too clear, too sharp. Stars like pins stuck into dark velvet. Cold enough to make her joints ache in ways old age didn't always warn her about. She walked onto the porch wrapped in the quilt. The air held its breath. Inside, the record had just ended. The spinning stopped. She sat down, let herself drift. No crowing, no music, no visitation, just the wind, and then, softer than anything, a low, slow strum. Not from the house, not from the barn, but beneath her breastbone. Memory coaxed into sound. Feathers in the dark. Arthur's laugh, just on the edge of hearing. She closed her eyes. "I remember," she whispered. "Still with me." And behind her lids, a kitchen lit only by firelight. A rooster standing in a doorway. A man playing guitar without looking at the frets. She didn't cry. Didn't need to. She curled her fingers around the edge of the quilt. Held it tight. "You kept your promise," she said. And the wind, generous as ever, carried the words off, so even the silence could hum.